Okay, so how do you feel that your sequencing lesson went yesterday?
So I think that we started off really strong in terms of what we did during reading. I had Gabriel read silently the pages, and then before he would move to the next page, I had him check in. So I would ask him a bunch of questions about what he just read and very specific to the text. So something like, how did this connect to the story that we read about Hades, and going back to previous texts as well as what we just read. So that kind of tied everything together for the sequencing. I made sure that my questioning during reading was going to set him up for the sequencing activity. Mm-hmm. So I would say that the sequencing activity was a little bit challenging for him, just because it may have been too many parts. When I made the activity, I wanted it to be all of the important details that I found he should be restating with the sequencing. But towards the end of the activity, I could see that he was running out of stamina. So I put it to the side and I was like, okay, this is the beginning parts, and he was able to sequence those. There were a few steps that he kind of jumped into and placed. For example, Zeus's father, his name was Cronus. So he put that as the first one. But there's actually a step before that with Cronus's father. So that kind of set up the idea overall that Zeus's father did all of these things because of his dad. Okay. And that was kind of the overall understanding that I wanted Gabriel to get out of it. The sequence of events of, because this happened in the very beginning, it caused Zeus's life to be this way. Okay. So I think overall he did a very nice job. In terms of my planning, I think that it was too much. So if I were to do this activity again, I probably would take out a few steps.
So I hear you saying that you felt like the lesson overall went well, but the sequencing was maybe just a little bit too tricky, and that if you were to do it again, you would kind of just take out a couple steps.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, too, is just the topic material can be very challenging. Gabriel is very familiar with the stories, but I think a challenge for him is, comparing his background knowledge and what he's previously read somewhere else can kind of differ based on the author. So I think he's kind of battling with that as
I was having some thoughts about that too, because I was wondering if, he has all this background knowledge and then now he's reading something, and is it matching his background knowledge or is it something new that he's learning, and how could that affect your lesson if it's something different that he doesn't know?
So what we do to kind of gauge what he already knows, I'm not sure if you noticed, but on the whiteboard we drew a map.
Oh, I saw it. It was like a web.
Yeah, like a little web. Mm-hmm. So that was some of the background knowledge. And then I would state, oh, that sounds really interesting. I think that you might have to really think about that when we're reading today. So, for example, he said that Zeus was married to someone else. Okay. And that could have been a mistress that he read about down the line, because Zeus was well known for that. And through this lesson, I've learned a lot from Gabriel, too. So examples of just letting him know that things might be different. And so that lends itself to the lesson because he's able to start comparing and contrasting his background knowledge and what he's reading and kind of putting it all together.
Okay. So if you were to do this lesson again, and I know we said that, the sequencing might have been a little bit too difficult, how might you see a lesson going if you were to do this again?
So today's lesson isn't quite sequencing, but instead summarizing. So I'm going to be using those cards again, having them in order, and then having him summarize the story. We're reading the same story. Using those sequencing cards. So understanding the idea that all of those important elements go into the summarization of the story, or the summary of the story. And another thing that I was thinking is, instead of using the cards, just doing it on paper, because that's more similar to, I guess, what he would see in the classroom in a test setting, just numbering the different activities and events.
So I hear you saying that you really could use these sequencing cards for a couple different activities. Yes. Yeah, definitely. So how do you know? Do you believe your lesson objective was met? How do you know that?
Okay, so my objective was that he would be able to sequence the story events to form an understanding of how Zeus came to power. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, the extra sequencing cards that I kind of pushed to the side, they didn't fully meet that objective. It was almost extra information. Okay. So the ones that we were looking at did meet the idea of how he did come to power. So in those terms, I think that he did meet my objective, just because looking back at it, he was able to kind of put the other ones in when he looked at what was left. Mm-hmm. And so today I would like to have him read through it again and then kind of see how he can put all those ideas together.
Great. So you had asked me to specifically look at your prompting and different questions you were asking or different follow-ups you were doing. How do you feel your prompting went yesterday?
Okay, so there was one moment that I was actually really excited about. So the text said that for Zeus to come to power, he needed to draw lots. And I said, what did that mean? And he was like, oh, they had a drawing competition. And I was like, really? Like they were drawing with a pen and a paper? And he was like, yeah. And I tried to put it into kid terms for him. So I kind of compared it to like how you put your foot in and say bubble gum in a dish, or, you know, taking the shortest straw out of the stack. And he was very unfamiliar with those terms, which kind of leads back to like his funds of knowledge where he said that, you know, he spends all of his time with adults. So because of that, he's probably not used to, okay, this is how we figure out who's it for tag. Mm-hmm. This is who gets to hide first and hide and seek. So taking that into consideration and trying to find more relevant examples for him is a little bit of a challenge. But after we discussed that, he was able to kind of imagine what it would be like to do an activity like that, to play a game.
Yeah, and through the data that I took, it was really interesting to go back and to kind of look at that, because the prompting that you provided kind of helped him get an idea of, you know, what exactly you were talking about. So in the future, if something like that were to happen, or you were, you know, talking about an idea or something comes up in the text that Gabe's not aware of, what could you do? Like,
So usually what I like to try to do is, if it's not personal to them, make it personal to me. I found a lot of my students in my teaching experience as well as tutoring, they react really well to something that's personal to your life. So if I were to say, you know, like, well, when I was a kid, I used to do this game and I used to really, really not like when I was the last one in, because that meant I was it first. And I always like to hide first. So making it a little more personal, I think, could possibly help him form that background knowledge as well.
Yeah. So in the future, if you were to have to do like different prompting again, or I mean, prompting's a part, I guess, of all of our lessons. Is there something you would think about doing differently with your prompting next time?
I think when I was looking at the data, I was pretty pleased with the way that I did most of my prompting. I think that I could have pushed him a little bit more when he was like, I don't know. And like one of his normal responses is just like, meh. I'm like, okay, well.
It's funny, I went to take my notes and I was like, and I had an and I had an
yes.
and
So sometimes, like, I've kind of been trying to figure him out, and I think it's just a part of Gabe's personality. Sometimes he just doesn't want to engage in further conversation for that. So that's kind of a judgment call for me. Like, if it's not really the most important question relating back to the sequencing, I'm able to brush it aside. If it's a question that really does lend itself to that activity, then I'll push him a little bit more. So I tried to do that, and based on the information that you gave me, I think that I did a pretty decent job kind of gauging when I should push and when I should kind of lay back a little bit.
Great. So I guess my last question for you is, I know you mentioned a little bit about what you're going to do moving forward and working with summarizing. Do you continue to think that you're going to like use this topic for him since he's so interested? Or what's your thoughts about that?
We've already read 2 Greek mythology stories, and I want to make a connection with my theorist. So she's all about multicultural education, and Gabriel's background is that he's from the Philippines. His parents speak Filipino, and so I found a story yesterday, actually, where it's a Filipino myth. So it's still tying along with that idea of, like, the myths and the legends, but now it's going into his background. So we're going to read a story for fluency that's a little bit easier to kind of explain what it's like at the Philippines. He said that he's visited before, so comparing that information to his personal experience and then leading it into the myth.
Okay.
So not necessarily Greek mythology, but keeping with the genre.
But it seems like you're saying that you'd have that connection still.
Yes.
You can make those connections and dwell on that background knowledge that he might have.
Exactly, because he kind of seems interested in, like, the mystery behind it, and he really likes when he understands how and why things happen. So I feel like he would really like to know the stories about, like, the mountains. And so it's like a story, it's called, like, The Sleeping Giant. So how they recognize that island based on this myth. Okay. So I think that will draw his interest. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, good luck. I'm looking forward to hearing about it.
Thank you.
Good.
great lesson. Thank you.